I'm not editing that, just so you know.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Made Known. I'm your host, Tyler Crawford, and with me, as always, is Mr. Manny Longfoot. How's it going, Manny?
It's going well. You ready to get in trouble today?
Yeah, this is a good passage to try and get in some trouble.
No matter what we do, we're going to be too complementarian for the egalitarians and too egalitarian for the complementarians. So,
yeah, pretty much. Do you want to give a short recap of last time?
we can. So, chapter 10, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the lesson from history on idolatry and then included a couple things in there. Paul gave some examples of sexual immorality and grumbling and different things that he called idolatry. And then we went on to speak about the other issue of idol worship, and that is demons. And why you don't partake with idol worship is because you're partaking in sacrifices of demons, and he connects it to the Lord's Supper, where when you eat the Lord's Supper, you are making yourself one with Christ. In the same way, if you participate in a sacrifice with a demon, you're essentially making yourself one with that demon.
Which is not good.
Right.
So let's go ahead and jump on in here. We'll be starting in chapter 11. We're going to start in verse 2 because we covered verse 1 last time because it really just fits in the passage. When you go through, verses were not there for a really long time. It was just you had the book. And whenever they decided to section it up, sometimes they didn't do the best job because guess what? The people that put the verses where they are were not inspired.
Yeah.
All right. So they can put those numbers in the wrong places when it comes to what a passage is actually doing and what he's trying to say. But they are helpful to find what you're looking for. So we're restarting in verse 2. I'm reading out of the New King James. How far do you want me to read it?
If you want to read verse 8, I'll read the other 8.
Okay. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man.
Verse 9, neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God.
All right. So before we get into this, because this can be a sticky situation on all ways, especially in the world we live in today, because I don't see but two genders in there, not a spectrum of them. So let's just pray real quick and make sure not everybody's upset. All right?
Okay.
All right. Lord, I thank you for your word and that we trust your word above anybody else's. And that if it's in your word, it needs to be looked at, studied to see what you have to say. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right. So the first thing is this chapter is not only very difficult, but has a lot of disagreement on it, so that should make you maybe be hesitant to be dogmatic. And the second thing is, I think maybe what would be helpful would not to just take this chapter by itself, right, but keep in mind the last 3 chapters we talked about. I know that's quite a few episodes for the last 3 chapters, but I think the subject of idolatry is really important and sexual immorality for that matter, which you talked about in the last chapter, is really important for what he's going to discuss here, and I think that'll help the discussion.
Right.
What we will be discussing is probably not child-friendly, because it does have a lot to do with sexual immorality, but
The Bible don't play no games.
No. With that being said, you ready to jump in?
Jump in.
All right, verse 2. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you. And I'm going to pause there for a moment. One of the only times he praises him in this letter, and it's very short-lived because he takes and turns around in verse 17 and says, in this matter, I do not praise you. And he's talking about the Lord's Supper. And then, of course, he goes on to basically say, even though the most of them held to the tradition he's given them, some of them haven't. Do you want to say anything before I go to read verse 3?
No, that was pretty much what I had to say.
Okay.
It's the first praise we've seen in a while. There's not a lot of praising going on
Not
here.
for the Corinthians.
And also, they did remember. Some of them did. A lot of them didn't. But do what Paul says. We should be imitating him as we imitate Christ. Right. So that's all.
Verse 3. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And so this is why I said that no matter what we do, we're going to be too egalitarian for the complementarian and too complementarian for the egalitarian. For people who aren't familiar with those terms, an egalitarian is someone who essentially believes there's different levels, but that women can be in any role in ministry and church, and a complementarian says no, specific roles women are forbidden from. And then you have different levels of that within both of those groups. The first thing I would point out is the Bible is very hierarchical. I almost stumbled over that word. And to say that it is demeaning to submit is a problem, because one part of Paul's argument is that Christ submits to God. And if it's demeaning and means that they're of less nature or less value, you have a problem because Christ himself submitted. In fact, we might even just pop over, if I can speak English, to Philippians chapter 2 real quick. Oh, if I can get there.
The race. I beat you. What verse?
I believe verse 6 and 7.
Okay.
Go for it.
All right. Verse 6. Who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men.
There you go. And of course, the context of that passage is referring to Christ. And so the first thing I would say is just because there is a hierarchy and someone is in charge, and in this case, Paul is kind of making the statement that the man has authority over the woman, does not make the woman subordinate in the case that she's less valuable. And so I would say from either side, whether it's someone who wants to say because the man has the authority, therefore the woman's less valuable, or the other side, the person who wants to argue that because the man has the authority, that therefore treating the women as they're less valuable is a serious issue, because Paul's argument is that Christ himself submitted to God's will. And so it cannot mean that they're less valuable, but rather that submission itself is a good thing.
Right. When you look at the first part of verse 3, it says the head of every man is Christ. Mm-hmm. That's the context before he goes into the roles that is basically the divine order. Like hierarchy is in Scripture, and that's just what it is. And Christ is the head of every man there is, whether they submit to that headship or not. And so we don't like terms submit. You know, we're Americans. Yeah. We're good Americans. We don't submit to anything, especially if you're a Baptist. Most of those are very independent, and I can say that because I'm one of them. We'll fight over carpet color, you know. But that when it comes to submission, every man is to be submissive to Christ, and then it goes down the line. And so submission is not a bad thing. If Christ came as a bondservant, we probably should too.
Now, there is a debate on this passage what the Greek word kephale, meaning head, means, because Paul is using it here figuratively, and then in the next verse he's going to go on to use it literally for the head. And the question is, does kephale mean authority, or does it mean source? The egalitarian is going to argue that it means source, whereas the complementarian is going to argue it means authority. I'm not going to get into like the nitty gritty. I would say if you want a good argument over that, go read Zondervan's book, 4 Views on Women in Ministry. Is a good opinion, is a good way to look at it, because it's 2 egalitarians, 2 complementarians. And they're all scholars. So it's a fair way to look at it. But given this passage, it seems to me that authority is the best way to take it. And to even show further that I don't think that this has anything to do with sexism, I'm going to read a couple quotes from the early church fathers who were understanding it the same way I am. We're going to start with Pelagius, just to make the Calvinists upset.
Pelagian perspective.
And then,
Heard it here, folks.
and then we'll go to John Chrysostom to make the Eastern Orthodox happy. Right. So Pelagius says on verse 3, he says, the man is the head of the woman in the natural order, but not in Christ, in whom there is neither male nor female. Nevertheless, Paul wanted women to be subject to their husbands. God is the head of Christ's humanity because the divinity which is in the human Jesus controlled his doings. And so Pelagian obviously understood this as an authority issue, but recognized that just because the man had authority over the woman, just like God has authority over Christ's humanness, does not make them less valuable. And then John Chrysostom says the word head is used in two different senses here, since otherwise absurdity would result. The distance between Christ and man is far greater than between man and woman on one hand, or between Christ and God on the other, and is of a different kind. Christ and God are equal in substance, but different in relationship, and the same applies to man and woman. So I'm just saying that because I don't think the argument from either side, whether it be to try and demean women or to say that this does demean women, works well for this passage.
Right.
So
that's good. So don't be hard-nosed on either side here.
No, go for it.
Yeah, it's like, I'm going to put it bluntly, you don't have to be a butthole no matter what side you take. Because to be perfectly honest, you have complementarians that are sexist and show it and flaunt it and give everybody else that is one, makes them look bad. And then you've got egalitarians that are so far the other way that they can be affirming in every other sense. Mm-hmm. So I suggest the middle course and don't be mean.
And that is my point, is I think this passage supplies the middle course. It does support authority, and of course, humility and subjection willingly, but it also supports equality. And so I think it's a happy middle ground. And with that being said, one more comment before we move on. Paul makes the argument over head figuratively so that he can make the argument that when you dishonor your literal physical head, you are dishonoring your figurative head. Right. So when you, for instance, we're about to get into head coverings, when you dishonor your head because you're using a head covering wrong or not using it, you dishonor your authority. So if you are a wife who is going around flaunting your hair, we'll get into that in a little bit, you're dishonoring your husband. And if your husband covers his head in an act of worship, he is dishonoring his head, which is Christ. So,
absolutely good. It's a good double entendre. It can mean both things. It's a both and, not an either or.
Right.
So don't split those hairs.
And I think that's the setup that Paul is making. Right. So,
verse 4.
Yep.
Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Keep going or stop?
Go into verse 6 and we'll backtrack.
Okay. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head was shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered.
Okay.
Stumbled through that well enough.
I stumbled through when I was reading earlier. I could barely get the word hierarchy out. You want to say anything, or do you want me to take it off?
Go for it. Okay. Manny's got a lot more material on this. I am going background. Some of this stuff is hard to jumble through, so you're not the only ones if you're watching.
Okay. Let me say a few things. One is when he talks about both men uncovering their heads and women covering their heads, the Romans covered their heads in order to worship their gods. And keep in mind, Corinth is a Roman colony.
Right.
But Corinth is also a seaport that contains multiple ethnicities. It's Greeks, it's Romans, it's Jews. The Greeks uncovered their heads to worship. Specifically, in our context, when I said the last 3 chapters, he talked about idolatry. Now, we talked about really the last 3 chapters and the very first episode, all the temples in Corinth, and specifically the temple of Aphrodite. And the temple of Aphrodite, you made sexual sacrifices. Well, what the women would do was uncover their head. They would take off their head covering or their veil or both to make a sexual sacrifice, because hair was the primary object of lust in the first century.
Very devout people.
Yeah, it's a very odd thing.
Yeah, in our world where you can see anything at the touch of a finger, it's a very, very different kind of world.
Yeah.
You don't think about women's hair being all that.
Right.
But back then, it was a lot more.
So it was for a number of reasons. One is women were constantly covered. So, for instance, in 1 Peter 3, Peter actually connects modesty to women not adorning their hair for attention. In your Old Testament, you notice a woman, when she commits adultery, has her head shaved. And when Paul talks about a woman having her head shaved here, is the same as not wearing a head covering because it's dishonorable. In Roman law, if a woman committed adultery, her head would be shaved as a act of shame for her act because it was considered sexual. And so there are two things. One is the hair, if you had healthy long hair as a woman, was considered that you were fertile and attractive. And so if you had short hair, you were not fertile and attractive. And so if you kept your hair on display, and this is a house church. So I guess I should probably make a comment about the terms women and men. If you look in your footnotes in most Bibles, if you have an ESV, first of all, it will translate it as husbands and wife, and some other translations as well. But if you look in your footnotes, it will tell you that it could be translated husbands and wife. So what's most likely going on here is they're in a house church, right? The women are coming in and they're uncovering their heads to worship like a Greek would do in the temple of Aphrodite. And they're distracting the husbands because essentially they're trying to seduce them. And of course, Paul's argument is it's not appropriate to go into church with the intent to sexually seduce someone, right?
Yeah, don't do that. Not good.
Tracking.
I'm tracking with you.
Tracking so far?
I'm tracking.
Okay, so let me give you a quote by Pelagius again, because I kind of like the guy, even if he was condemned a heretic. Yeah.
So was Origen, right?
Yeah, so was Origen. But Origen was redeemed later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so, well, to be fair, he was also not condemned a heretic 200 years after he died.
Yeah.
Which is really weird. Anyway, a quote from Pelagius on verse 5 says, Paul was complaining because men were fussing about their hair and women were flaunting their locks in church. Not only was this dishonoring to them, but it was also an incitement to fornication. And so Pelagian understood it as if you uncovered your hair. It was literally called going around with a nude head. In fact, Apolitus in the first century actually wrote a book in which his character was going out and looking at women's bare heads and memorizing their hair so he could go home and lust after it later. It's completely foreign to us, but if you think about it, if something is sexual on someone, does it not make sense to cover it up? And certainly in a church context. Or how about, would you want your spouse going in front of someone else in a seductive sexual manner? That is essentially what Paul's dealing with. And so I know head coverings are a touchy subject because some churches still use them. A lot of Catholic churches still use them. Some Church of Christ still use them. And you want to be careful when you go, oh, that's just cultural. But I do think the principle could still apply. And that is that you don't go and worship God with your privates on display, or you don't go and put yourself in a position to seduce someone's spouse or anyone for that matter just because you can. So.
Don't go to church in a bikini.
Yeah.
All right. You know what it is to be modest. And I mean, that is a question you have to ask, is how much of this is cultural and how much is literal in those things? Because women don't wear head coverings and that doesn't bother me a bit. So these are questions that need to be asked, and sometimes you have to really work through them. But do your best.
Yeah. I would relate it to this. If you were, for instance, to go to northern Nigeria or to go to a Muslim country, you should wear a head covering if you're a woman, because it's the appropriate thing to do and because they view it sexually. Here, I think it's okay not to because it has nothing to do with a sexual thing. So that's where I think Paul's principle applies.
Right.
And so one more thing about verse 5 before we move on. I know I'm starting to sound like an egalitarian, but I promise I'm not. Verse 5 says, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovers dishonors her head. So what Paul says in chapter 14 about women being silent in the church cannot contradict what he's just said about women praying and prophesying in the church. So just keep that in mind when we get to chapter 14. And also for like the hardcore compliment, because there's a lot of complementarians that won't even let a woman lead prayer in church. And that's clearly not the case here. So do I think their roles are limited in what they can do, just like I think most men's roles are limited in what they can do in the church? Yes, I do. But don't go beyond what the scripture says. I don't think Paul is contradicting himself when he says let the women be silent in the church.
Yeah.
2 chapters or 3 chapters later. So
Yeah, he expects him to be praying. And
right.
prophesying. So how many are prophesying in your church? Question. All right. For another day.
Right. Oh, I guess one more note.
Okay.
Verse 5, since you mentioned that, I guess if you're gonna jab them, I'll jab them back. If you're gonna interpret prophecy in Romans chapter 12 as preaching, you should be consistent enough to do it here and be an egalitarian. You should not be a complementarian if you think prophecy in Romans 12 is preaching. But anyway, I will not digress there until we get to chapter 12,
Right.
like 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, it's coming up. What verse?
Do you have anything to say there?
Not really. I mean, it just basically what I've written is what you already said.
Okay.
Those things are disgraceful and be discreet.
Yeah.
Don't be a Babylonian harlot. Goes for men too, you know.
That's true. Yeah.
It's like it's all about keeping things in the proper order. And you know what the proper order is, especially in whatever body of believers you're in.
Mm-hmm.
Each church has the right proper order that you know that they do. So stay within that. Don't make a heel of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So
verse 7 through 9.
All right. Want me to read it or you want to?
Go for it.
All right. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man.
Yeah. So this passage is kind of difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's really difficult to track what he's saying. And especially when I look at the commentaries, they kind of just skip over this passage, which is not helpful. It's not helpful at all, because it's the one spot that I'm like, please give me some help. But it does what Paul is essentially doing. My best understanding of what he's doing here is he's just got done setting up his argument, right, for why a man shouldn't cover his head and why a woman should. And it has to do with modesty. And so his argument essentially here is, because you are in the image of God and the glory of them, right? Man is the glory of God, woman is his glory. When you dress immodestly or act in an immodest way, you are shaming them rather than bringing them glory. That is my best understanding of this passage. I don't know if you have anything, maybe a better way to put it.
I don't know about a better way, but this is mainly in modesty, but also if you go back up when it was talking more of the authoritative view, is this culture is highly hierarchical, like we said. And so like firstborn and first created is an important thing. If you have a child, the firstborn son, he's going to inherit everything else. And you may have subsequent 12 children. They're not going to get all of that same responsibility, because there comes more responsibility with that place of authority and taking. But it's not that those kids that come after are less worthy or less important or anything else, but that's the order in. And so when Paul goes and says, man is not from woman, but woman from man, he's going to go a little later and say, yes, man still comes through woman. So it's not to degrade or anything else. But if you're looking in an authorial sense, I think one way to understand it is that order of creation plays a part.
Mm.
And we may not think about it as much in our culture, but it was a big deal in theirs.
Right.
So that's what I have for that.
Okay. I think that probably was better than how I said it.
Okay.
I said you didn't have, but essentially, yeah, Paul's argument is when you don't submit, you don't bring glory. Just as when the man does not submit to God, he does not bring glory, even though he's in his image. And the same thing when the woman is not submitting. And when you are essentially with your husband by your side, seducing other men, you are not submitting to your husband. It is plain and simple.
It's bad taste.
Which is why I think he goes on later to make the statement, judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? As in, this should be easy. I shouldn't even have to tell you this. Why would I have to tell you that it's inappropriate to go naked, if you will, before someone's spouse?
Yeah.
So anyway, you ready to get to the most interesting verse of the chapter, possibly the letter?
Sure.
All right. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. What does that mean?
It's a good question. I looked and thought, and I'm like, Dude, that's just weird. That is so weird. Why they should have authority over their head because of angels. Jump into it.
Okay. So you'll see two mainline translations here. One is should have a symbol of authority. In fact, most translations will actually go with that.
That's what this one says.
Right.
Mine in verse 10, it says, "For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority over her head because of the angels."
Right. So the NIV and a couple others translates it ought to have authority over her own head. And actually, the word symbol is supply. It's not in the Greek. And so I do think have authority over her head is a better translation. And I also think it makes more sense of the explanation I'm going to give you for this verse. So also, I think it's very hard to say it's okay to not have head coverings if Paul's argument is, hey, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, and the symbol is the head covering.
Right.
If that is the case, women should probably still be wearing head coverings in all cultures.
Yeah.
Um,
Amish and Mennonite, baby.
Yep. Oh, yeah, I left them out. I mentioned Catholics and Church of Christ. I didn't mention the Amish and Mennonites.
Yeah.
So there's about 4 views, but we're going to just cover 2, and then I'll tell you which one I think is most. One is actually, you find this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So like N.T. Wright, who is a scholar both of us really like, holds to this view, and that is that Jewish people believed when you worshiped, angels attended the worship and worshiped with you. So if you were to act in an unholy way, the angels are observing that. And of course, that's displeasing to them because they're there to worship with you. You have, right, for instance, in chapter 4, Paul says that we've been made a spectacle to angels. So angels are observing authorities. In the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews makes the comment that you may be entertaining angels unawares. So it is a very possible view. Mm-hmm. You also have a number of instances in your Old Testament where people did not realize they were talking to angels, and then they find out later that was an angel, or God himself in human form, such as with Abraham. The other view that I think is probably what's going on here is what I'll call the sexual sin view. And that is the view, by the way, that both of these views are supported by church fathers. So the early church writer Ambrose supports the view I just articulated. Tertullian will support the view I'm about to articulate. And that is that in Genesis 6, you have the sons of God go into the daughters of men after they see that they're pleasing, which is essentially what Tertullian says about this passage. So I'll spare you his quote. In your New Testament, you actually have 2 other instances of sexual sin, and since I believe that's what's happening in this passage, being mentioned in connection with angels. That is both in Jude and in 2 Peter, and they're both connected back to Genesis 6.
Right.
And so if the concern is you're dressing in a sexual way and being lewd, so you should have authority over your head, and other words, you should take care of it and act in a responsible way because of the angels and because of what they've done in the past. So I think the interpretation, have authority over your head, makes sense because of that. If that is what Paul is thinking, and I think it probably is, right? Is that Paul is worried that you might have a worse one-night stand than what you're expecting.
Have some Nephilim babies.
Right? And I think that is Paul's concern is, the angels have done it before. They've rebelled because of women's lewdness. They may do it again.
I think that's good enough.
Okay.
I don't have anything to say to that.
Okay. That's the view I take. It may be wrong, but I think it makes sense out of his concern. Well, it's either a concern or just a blanket statement, I guess. But I think it makes sense out of his concern. I also think it makes sense why he would say, have authority over your head, especially in the sexual context of the passage. So
be in control over yourself.
Right. In other words, men and women both should be modest, whether it be because of your fellow Christians or because of the angels. So,
self-control. It's part of the fruit of the Spirit.
All right.
Perfect. All right. 11. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through women. But all things are from God.
Okay. So you want to go ahead or you want me to?
Take it.
Okay.
I'll jump in.
So essentially, Paul has just got done making the argument of authority, the woman submitting to the husband, and he kind of doubles down on that by saying, just because the woman comes from man does not mean that he is superior as an individual to her, because the man ultimately ends up coming back to the woman. And more importantly, they both come from God. And so who the ultimate authority is God. So
Absolutely. I mean, that goes back to what I said earlier when it comes to the authority of it. And you don't want to cause dishonor to whoever. I don't want to cause dishonor to the Lord.
Right.
And so I know my wife doesn't want to cause dishonor to me. So we live in a way that we're both all subject unto God because all things come from him. And so as long as we live in that kind of humility, I'm not independent of my wife, and my wife ain't independent of me, and we're both subject to God.
Yeah.
So,
that's a good explanation.
all right.
Verses 13. Probably go ahead. Well,
Finish it out.
Yeah, go ahead and finish it out.
All right. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. The first thing I want to say about this is look over at Manny's long, luscious locks. See the nice swoop? Let's see, is that's dishonoring or not?
I got a haircut like a month ago. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I guess, yeah. So the question is it okay for a man to have long hair?
Yeah.
Why?
We have no such custom, nor do the churches of God.
Okay. I think we might have a disagreement about what you said.
Maybe so.
Okay, let's go back to verse 13. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? So, of course, if Paul's just got done arguing you're acting in a sexual manner, his question is essentially, is it not easy enough to decide that you should cover your head? Right? And then he goes on to make a very odd argument, and that is an argument from nature.
Mm-hmm.
That does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him. But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for hair is given to her as a covering. So without getting graphic, because this is, if you look at Hippocrates' discussion of this, it's quite graphic with what he discusses sexually. So the best way to sum it up is, it was believed if a man had long hair, he was infertile. And so, of course, it's a disgrace for him to have long hair. If a woman had short hair, or unhealthy hair for that matter, she was infertile. And so to have long, luscious hair for a woman was a good thing because it made her desirable and fertile. For a man to have long, luscious hair meant that he was not fertile and thus not desirable as a husband. And so it was, of course, a disgrace both ways, which is why you covered your hair, because it was a lustful thing. And so, yes, I do think it's okay for men to have long hair, because I don't think that has anything to do with fertility. But it does make sense with what Paul is talking about in the first century context. Right. Once again, the principle still applies. Even if you don't apply it in the same sense of hair, because we don't look at hair sexually or think it has anything to do with fertility, I think the context applies, and that is that you don't go around displaying your sexuality to the world.
You heard it here, LGBT. Don't go around having like parades about it.
And then, in verse 15, if anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. And that is essentially, Paul is saying, if you want to argue, I have no time for argument's sake. And that is that you judge for yourself if it's okay to do, but all the other churches do use the head covering. So,
yeah. I would kind of agree with that pretty much. I mean, I don't think it's a big disagreement there. It's not like, sinner! You have long hair even then.
So I guess the question is it okay for women not to wear head coverings now?
My wife doesn't.
Yeah. I think it's okay, but I think apply the principle.
Yeah.
Same thing. We talk about cultural things, but we want to be careful. So, for instance, we talked about in the very first episode of this podcast, in chapter 16, how he ends it out by saying, greet each other with a holy kiss, right? And you'll notice, well, I guguess you didn't see me when I got it here, but I'll say, when I came in, Tyler and I did not greet each other with a kiss. And if it
was a handshake,
I shouldn't say that.
It's a handshake deal.
Yeah. No, I won't say that.
Okay, good. At that point, we're trying to keep these episodes shorter. So, Manny, if you have any closing thoughts to wrap us up, we're getting close to 35 minutes.
Okay. Essentially, be modest. There's no reason to go around sexually or seduce people or to refuse to submit, because when you do, whether you're a man refusing to submit to God or one refusing to submit to a man, you are dishonoring God.
Your husband, not just any dude.
Yeah.
So throw that out there. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did and you like some of the content we're producing, please hit the like, share, subscribe, comment. We'll take on questions. If there's something you want us to go over, any kind of different topic that's out of the norm. We're getting closer to the end of this book. It's going to be a few weeks before we're there, but we'll be happy to jump in and do that if you have any questions. So thank you very much. We love you. Go share Jesus and keep it in your pants.